Hey there, I'm Jack Thompson from Creepy Whispers. Today, we're diving into a story that'll blow your mind. Let's get started. The rumble of the engine was my only companion on that suffocating summer night. I had been on the road for almost 12 hours, my eyes burning with fatigue, my sweaty hands gripping the steering wheel. The load of electronics in the trailer behind me weighed on my conscience, a responsibility that kept me alert, but also slowly consumed me. The radio crackled, picking up only static. I had given up trying to tune into a station hours ago. The silence was almost tangible, broken only by the monotonous sound of tires on asphalt. My mind wandered, filled with fragmented thoughts and memories distorted by exhaustion. That's when I saw the sign announcing a rest area a few kilometers away. I felt immediate relief, mixed with a twinge of apprehension I couldn't explain. I needed to stretch my legs, have a coffee, anything to ward off the sleep that threatened to overwhelm me. But something deep in my mind screamed to keep driving, to ignore that concrete oasis in the middle of nowhere. I ignored the voice of intuition. After all, what danger could there be in a simple stop? The rest area appeared like an island of light in an ocean of darkness. It was a simple place, a small concrete building housing bathrooms and a snack bar, surrounded by an empty parking lot. A single streetlight flickered intermittently, creating dancing shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. I parked the truck and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. I could hear my own breathing, heavy and irregular, and the blood pulsing in my ears. The air was still, charged with an inexplicable tension that made my hair stand on end. I opened the cab door, and the heat hit me like a wave, bringing with it a strange smell. It was a mixture of hot asphalt, diesel oil, and something else I couldn't identify, a metallic odor that made my stomach churn. My feet touched the ground, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The place was completely deserted, which wasn't unusual at that time of night, but there was an atmosphere of abandonment that went beyond the mere absence of people. The windows of the snack bar were dark and dusty, as if no one had opened them in years. That's when I saw them, two teenagers, standing under the flickering light of the lamppost. They simply appeared. One moment, the parking lot was empty. The next, there they were. I rubbed my eyes hard, thinking fatigue was playing tricks on me. But when I opened them again, they were still there, more vivid and disturbing than before. Their clothes were the first thing I noticed. Faded jeans of a cut I hadn't seen in decades, 80 Seconds band t-shirts, leather jackets too heavy for that stuffy night. But it wasn't this that made my blood run cold. It was the paleness of their skin, a sickly whiteness, almost translucent, that made it seem like I could see the veins pulsing beneath the surface. And their eyes. My God, those eyes. Black and empty, fixed on me with an intensity that made me question my own existence. I tried to speak, to ask if they needed help, but my voice caught in my throat. The air around me seemed to have become denser, making each breath difficult. I felt a wave of nausea hit me, accompanied by a sensation of vertigo so intense that I had to lean on the truck to keep from falling. The teenagers didn't move. They didn't blink. They just stared at me with those empty eyes, as if they could see through me, as if they were reading my soul. I felt a chill in the pit of my stomach, a feeling of dread so deep that I thought I might faint. Suddenly, one of them took a step forward. It wasn't a natural movement, it was as if he had glided across the asphalt, his feet barely touching the ground. I wanted to run, to get in the truck, and get out of there as fast as I could, but my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed, trapped in that surreal moment that seemed to stretch infinitely. The teenager raised his hand towards me. His fingers were long and pale, almost skeletal. When he opened his mouth, I expected to hear a voice, any voice. But the silence remained, heavy and oppressive. It was as if the whole world had stopped breathing. I closed my eyes tightly, my heart beating so fast I thought it might explode in my chest. When I opened them again, they had disappeared. The teenagers, the feeling of dread, everything had vanished as if it had never existed. I stood there, paralyzed. For how long I can't say. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to have lost all meaning. My mind refused to process what had just happened. When I finally managed to move, my legs were shaking so much I could barely walk. I got into the truck with trembling hands, starting the engine before even fully closing the door. I got out of there as fast as I could, the tires screeching on the asphalt. I drove for hours without stopping, my heart beating erratically, my eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror, fearing to see those pale faces following me. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it had been a hallucination caused by extreme fatigue. Maybe some kind of paranormal experience. Or maybe something my mind simply wasn't equipped to understand. I never told this story to anyone. Who would believe it? A truck driver talking about ghostly teenagers in an abandoned rest area. But the event remained etched in my memory, as vivid as the moment it happened. Today, years later, I still sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, in a cold sweat, with the memory of those empty eyes staring at me. I keep driving, doing my routes, trying to lead a normal life. But I know that something fundamental has changed within me. My perception of the world, of what is possible and impossible, has been irrevocably altered. I see shadows where there was nothing before. I hear whispers in the wind that seem to carry messages from other worlds. And on the darkest nights, when I'm alone on the road, I feel as if something is watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again. Every time I pass a rest area at night, I feel a shiver run down my spine. My eyes involuntarily search for pale figures in the shadows. And deep in my mind, a voice whispers that there are more things in this world than we can understand. Things that exist on the borders of reality, waiting to be discovered or to discover us. I never saw those two teenagers again. Part of me hopes to never see them again. But another part, a part I don't like to admit exists, yearns for another encounter. To understand, to know the truth behind that impossible night, so. If one day you're driving late at night and see a rest area emerge from the darkness, think twice before stopping. Because sometimes the things we encounter on the road are not what they seem to be. And some stops, once made, can change not just the course of our lives, but our very understanding of reality. I was never the adventurous type. My life always revolved around the safe routine of the office, Netflix on weekends, and occasionally a happy hour with coworkers. But something changed that Friday. Maybe it was the accumulated fatigue from months of monotony, or maybe it was the challenging look in Lucas's eyes when he suggested camping. "Come on, man. One night in the forest won't kill you," he said, laughing. Little did he know how those words would haunt me later. I agreed, more to prove a point than out of real interest. On Saturday morning, as we loaded the car with backpacks and equipment, I felt an uneasiness I couldn't explain. The sky was an almost unreal blue, cloudless, as if nature was inviting us, or deceiving us. The car ride was smooth, filled with Lucas's jokes about my lack of camping experience and his stories of past adventures. We arrived at the trailhead around AM. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and dense vegetation. I took a deep breath, trying to absorb the tranquility of the moment, but something in the back of my mind was already alerting me. "This trail is less known," Lucas explained as he adjusted his backpack. "I found it on an online forum. They say the view at the top is breathtaking. We entered the forest, and I was immediately enveloped by a sense of claustrophobia. The trees were tall and dense, their branches intertwining above our heads, creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into strange patterns on the forest floor. The sound of our footsteps was muffled by the thick layer of dry leaves, creating an almost surreal atmosphere. At first, the hike was pleasant. Lucas pointed out different types of plants, sharing his knowledge about the local flora. I tried to focus on his words, but my mind kept returning to the feeling that something was wrong. It was around noon when I first noticed it. A subtle sound, almost imperceptible, like a distant echo of our own footsteps. I stopped abruptly, causing Lucas to almost bump into me. "What's wrong?" he asked, confused. "Didn't you hear that?" I replied, my eyes scanning the surroundings. Lucas frowned, listening for a moment. "It must be just the wind in the trees, man. Relax." We continued, but the feeling of unease only grew. The sound persisted, always maintaining a constant distance. When we stopped, it stopped. When we walked, it followed us. It was as if the forest itself was watching us, calculating every move. We reached a small clearing around p.m. The sun was at its peak, but its light barely penetrated the dense foliage above. We decided to stop to eat something. As Lucas unpacked the sandwiches, I felt a shiver run down my spine. I turned quickly, certain I would see someone or something watching us from the edge of the clearing. But there was nothing beyond the dancing shadows of the trees. "Are you okay?" Lucas asked, handing me a sandwich. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I tried to laugh, but the sound came out forced. "Just tired, I guess." This trail is tougher than I expected. We ate in silence, the tension palpable between us. Even Lucas, always so confident, seemed restless now. His eyes wandered through the forest, and I realized he was feeling something too. We resumed the hike, but the environment had changed. The forest, once serene, now seemed hostile. The shadows seemed deeper, the sounds more threatening. The echo of footsteps behind us intensified, as if our invisible pursuit had gained confidence. "Lucas," I whispered, my heart racing, "I think something's following us." He stopped, turning to me with an expression that mixed concern and irritation. "Look, I know you're not used to this, but there's nothing following us. It's just the forest, the animals." His words were interrupted by a loud sound of breaking branches, coming from somewhere to our right. We turned simultaneously, fear etched on our faces. For a moment, I thought I saw a dark figure moving between the trees, but it vanished so quickly, it could have been just my imagination. "Okay," Lucas said, his voice trembling slightly. "Maybe we should head back." I nodded, relieved not to have to suggest it myself. We started to return by the same path, but something was wrong. The trail looked different, as if the forest had reorganized itself while we were distracted. Panic began to set in when we reached a fork we didn't remember seeing before. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows across the forest floor. The air became heavy, laden with an acrid smell. We couldn't identify which way. I asked, my voice almost a whisper. Lucas hesitated, his face pale in the dim light. I don't know." It was at that moment that we heard it. A guttural sound, almost inhuman, echoing through the forest. It wasn't an animal we knew. It was something different. Something ancient and dangerous. Without thinking twice, we started running. Branches whipped our faces. Roots tried to trip us. The sound chased us, getting closer and closer. I could feel its presence, like an oppressive weight on my back. I don't know how long we ran. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed distorted, as if reality itself was unraveling around us. At some point, I realized I could no longer hear Lucas's footsteps behind me. I stopped abruptly, spinning in all directions. "Lucas," I shouted, my voice hoarse with fear. There was no response, just the echo of my own scream coming back to me, distorted and mocking. The darkness was almost complete now. I took my cell phone out of my pocket, my hands shaking so much I almost dropped it. There was no signal, of course. The bright screen only served to accentuate the shadows around me, creating shapes that seemed to move in the corner of my eyes. That's when I saw it. Between two trees in front of me, partially hidden by shadows, was a figure. Tall, taller than any human should be. Its shape was undefined, as if it were made of the very shadows of the forest. It had no face, just a dark void where it should have been. I froze, unable to move, to scream, to breathe. The creature, because there was no other word to describe it, leaned towards me. I heard nothing, but I felt its words reverberating inside my head. "You shouldn't be here." I woke up in the hospital 2 days later. Apparently, I was found by a search team on the roadside, dehydrated and delirious. Lucas was found a few hours later, in a similar state, a few kilometers away. Neither of us talks much about what happened in that forest. The authorities attributed everything to a combination of exhaustion, dehydration, and possibly some hallucinogenic plant we might have touched without realizing it. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear those footsteps again. And in the shadows of my room, for a fraction of a second, I see that faceless figure, reminding me that there are places in nature where we are not welcome. Places that should remain unexplored, and I wonder, did we really escape the forest? Or did we bring something back with us? Something that now patiently waits in the shadows, biding its time to reclaim what is its own. My name is Bob, and until a few months ago, I was just another face in the crowd of New York City. A maintenance technician in the subway tunnels, my life was a predictable cycle of night shifts and solitude. I had always been claustrophobic, but the job paid well, and I thought I could overcome my fears. How foolish I was. It was a stifling Tuesday in August. The city air was thick, sticky, as if it was about to suffocate its inhabitants. I received a call about a lighting failure in an old section of the system. These areas always made me uneasy, but nothing could have prepared me for what was to come. The service elevator descended with a metallic groan that sounded like a lament. The doors opened to a darkness so dense it seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. The air there was different, heavy, damp, with a smell that reminded me of oxidized copper and something else. Something organic and rotten. My footsteps echoed strangely, as if the tunnel itself was distorting the sound. While checking the wiring, I noticed a small crack in the wall. When I touched it, I felt something vibrate under my fingers. Suddenly, part of the concrete crumbled, revealing an opening that seemed to pulse in the darkness. My instinct screamed for me to leave, but something pulled me in. It was as if the tunnel was calling me, whispering promises of long-forgotten secrets. I entered, feeling the air cool drastically. The walls were covered with symbols that seemed to move under the light of my flashlight. Impossible shapes that made my eyes hurt as I tried to focus on them. Time seemed distorted there. Minutes dragged on like hours, and with each step, I felt I was moving further and further away from the reality I knew. That's when I saw the train car. Old, rusty, but somehow alive. The windows were foggy, as if someone had just breathed on them. The metal seemed to pulse, as if it had its own circulation. I entered the car, and the floor creaked under my feet, a sound that was more like a groan of pain. The interior was covered with a fine, shimmering dust that floated in the air, entering my lungs. Each breath made me feel more connected to that impossible place. That's when the whispers began. Overlapping voices in languages I didn't know, but somehow understood. They spoke of horrors beyond the stars, of realities folded upon themselves, of eyes that observe from dimensions the human mind cannot conceive. My heart was beating so hard I feared it might explode. That's when I saw the clock, ancient, golden, resting on the floor as if it had been waiting for me. The hands were frozen at 3:33, but as I touched it, I felt as if time had stopped throughout the universe. I ran. I ran like I had never run before. The voices intensified, screaming now, begging me to stay, promising knowledge beyond human comprehension. The opening was closing, the concrete reconstituting itself like healing flesh. I managed to escape, but something in me was left behind in that tunnel. Or perhaps something from that place came with me. Nobody believed my story. The opening had disappeared, as if it had never existed. But the changes in me were undeniable. My eyes, once brown, now have a strange golden glow. My skin sometimes seems translucent, revealing veins that pulse with a liquid I dare not call blood. The clock follows me. No matter where I hide it, it always reappears. At 3:33 every night, I wake up to the sound of gears turning and voices whispering in my ear. I see symbols on the walls, in the streets, on people's faces. Reality seems thin, fragile, as if at any moment it could tear and reveal what really exists beyond. I try to convince myself that it was just a nightmare, a hallucination caused by stress and claustrophobia. But then I smell the rusty metal and hear the distant sound of a train that shouldn't exist. If you're hearing this, take it as a warning. There are places in this world that shouldn't be found, doors that shouldn't be opened. If you ever come across a tunnel that's not on the maps, an abandoned train car that seems alive, or a golden clock stopped at 3:33, run. Run and don't look back. Because once you see, you become part of it, and they will never, ever let you go completely. Now, every time I close my eyes, I see that tunnel, and I'm sure that, from somewhere in the depths of the city, it sees me too. Since childhood, I've always been fascinated by mysteries and secrets. Perhaps it was a defense mechanism, a way to cope with my mother's inexplicable disappearance when I was just 5 years old. This obsession led me to an unusual career. I became an urban treasure hunter, an expert in abandoned storage unit auctions. For years, I rummaged through hundreds of these units, always hoping to find some clue about my mother's whereabouts. It was a fruitless search, I knew, but it was the only thing keeping me sane. Or at least, that's what I thought. Everything changed on that October morning. The sky was heavy, a cold, fine rain falling incessantly, as if the universe itself was trying to warn me to stay home. But there I was at another auction, my eyes fixed on Unit 237. There was something different about it. Something wrong. The peeling paint formed strange patterns, almost like distorted faces silently screaming. The padlock, unlike the others, seemed brand new. When the auctioneer announced the opening bid, I felt a chill down my spine. The number was exactly my mother's birth date. Destiny, I thought. Little did I know I was sealing my fate. I won the auction without any competition. No one else seemed interested in Unit 237. Now I know why. The creak of the rusty door echoed through the empty corridor as I opened it. A putrid, suffocating smell hit me like a punch to the gut, instinctively making my throat close. It was a nauseating mixture of mold, decay, and something else. Something that made my brain scream danger. I swallowed hard and entered, my flashlight trembling slightly in my sweaty hand. The beam of light danced over piles of dusty boxes and furniture covered with yellowed sheets. Each step made the floor creak disturbingly, as if the unit itself was protesting against my invasion. That's when my fingers brushed against a different box. The cardboard was damp, almost. Sticky. I opened it with my heart pounding in my chest, and the contents made me gasp. A stack of old diaries and a bunch of Polaroids. The covers of the diaries seemed to pulse under my fingers, as if they had a life of their own. I flipped through the pages with trembling hands. The names changed, but there was a sinister pattern. They all ended abruptly. The last entry in each mentioned a meeting at the Eclipse Cafe, a place I knew well. Or rather, used to know the establishment had closed years ago under nebulous circumstances. The Polaroids were even more disturbing. The smiles looked like ill-fitting masks, and the eyes. God, those eyes. Empty, pleading, as if the souls of those people had been ripped away at the moment of the click. One of the photos caught my attention. A dark-haired woman, her face strangely familiar. I turned the photo over and froze. On the back, written in frantic handwriting, "She knows. She's always known." My heart stopped. It was my mother. I took everything home, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts and theories. The night that followed was a waking nightmare. Each internet search revealed a darker truth. The faces in the photos belonged to missing people. Unsolved cases, lives interrupted without explanation. And my mother. She was at the center of it all. The next morning, I noticed for the first time the black car parked across the street. It was nothing special, just an ordinary sedan, but something about it made my skin tingle. Days passed, and the car remained there, motionless. Sometimes I swore I could see a reflection in the dark windows, as if someone was watching me, or something. I started seeing shadows in the corners of my eyes, hearing whispers when I was alone. The world around me seemed to have gained a sinister layer, as if a parallel and evil reality was overlapping with mine. Was I going crazy? One night, I woke up in a cold sweat. I had dreamed of the Eclipse Cafe. In the dream, I entered the abandoned place and found my mother sitting at a table, smiling that strange smile from the Polaroids. When I approached her, she dissolved into a mass of shadows that engulfed everything around. I decided I needed to go back to the storage unit. There had to be more clues, more answers. When I got there, my heart nearly stopped. The door was ajar, and I was sure I had locked it. I entered cautiously, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The smell seemed stronger, more alive. As I rummaged through the boxes again, my fingers touched something hidden. An envelope, yellowed and fragile, containing a letter written in the same frantic handwriting as the Polaroids. The words spoke of a group, a conspiracy behind the disappearances. And at the end, a phrase that made my blood run cold. They are everywhere, even inside us. That's when I heard it. A noise coming from the back of the unit. A wet, viscous sound. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I was sure I wasn't alone in there. Something was moving in the shadows, something that shouldn't exist. I ran. I ran like I had never run before, but the feeling of being chased didn't leave me. The black car was there, its engine purring softly. I passed by it, and for an instant, saw the reflection of the driver in the rearview mirror. It was me, smiling in a way that made my stomach churn. The weeks that followed were a blur of fear and paranoia. I could no longer distinguish reality from hallucination. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night and find Polaroids scattered around my room, all showing places I didn't recognize, but which somehow seemed familiar. Desperate, I shared my story with a private investigator. He seemed skeptical at first, but as I showed him the evidence, I saw the fear grow in his eyes. On a rainy night, he called me, his voice trembling with panic. He said he had discovered something too big for us to understand. We arranged to meet at the abandoned Eclipse Cafe. When I got there, my heart raced. The place was a skeleton of what it once was, the broken windows like empty eye sockets of a skull. As I entered, I felt as if I had crossed an invisible threshold. The air was charged with a strange energy, and each step made the floor creak in an almost intentional way. In the center of the hall, a solitary table. On it, a diary identical to those I found in the unit. I opened it with trembling fingers and my heart stopped. It was my handwriting. They were my memories. Memories of things I had never lived. Or had I? A whisper reached my ears, this time closer, almost touching my skin. "Welcome back," said the voice. A voice I knew all too well. My own voice. I turned slowly, my whole body shaking. And there I was. Or rather, a version of me. Smiling in that disturbing way I saw in the rearview mirror of the black car. "It's time to complete the cycle," my other self said, extending his hand. That's when I understood. The disappearances, the diaries, the Polaroids. It was all part of an infinite cycle. A time loop of which I was both the victim and the perpetrator. "You're me," I whispered from the future. My other self smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who carried the weight of countless cycles of horror and despair. "I'm you from all times," he replied. "Past, present, future. Everything mixes here. And now it's your turn to continue the cycle." He handed me a Polaroid. In it, I saw my mother, young and smiling, holding a baby. "Me, she knew," my other self said. "She always knew. And now you know too." As I write these words, I no longer know what's real. I'm trapped in an infinite loop of fear and confusion. The black car is still out there, waiting. And I know that, sooner or later, I'll have to get in it. Because some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. And some mysteries, once unraveled, consume us completely. If you're watching this video, please stay away from abandoned storage units. Stay away from the Eclipse Cafe. And above all, stay away from yourself. Because true horror, I discovered, isn't hidden in dark places or cursed objects. It's inside us, waiting for the right moment to awaken. And remember, every time you watch this video, every time you share this story, you too become part of the cycle. You too become me. The black car is waiting. It's time to go.